Okay guys, welcome back again. Today I'm going to give you a little view here of how we use cover crops and green manure crops on the farm on the old homestead here. The value of cover crops is threefold. There's the addition to soil nutrient level when the cover crop is turned under. Weed suppression is another big thing. And then there's the erosion control. We farm a piece of land here on the Miramichi River Valley that floods every year. In the spring when the ice jams goes, the river breaks up. We get a lot of flooding. We also get occasional flooding in the fall here. So we have to be very careful about leaving any exposed soil because erosion is a big thing here. We have to be very careful of that. So I'm going to turn the camera around here first off, and I'm going to show you a crop of oats that we planted. Now these oats were planted mid-July, I guess it was. We didn't plant them for a grain crop. We planted this solely for the purpose of growing straw for mulch in our strawberries or vegetables. So I'm going to give you a little glimpse here of them. Okay, so here we have it. This patch of oats here. Now if you can see from the grain stalk here, the oats are just emerging from the boot. Now when I say from the boot, if you look at the top of this stalk here, you can see that this stalk is swelled at this point. There's only one grain of oat that's actually emerged. There's a couple more. I don't know how well we can see it here. There's a few more just emerging from the boot at the top of the oat. Now if these oats are cut at this stage right now, where there's only, I would venture to guess, less than 15% of the oats that are actually out of the boot. If they're cut at this stage right here, they can be used for oat hay, for feeding livestock. Once you get much more emergence on the grain head, where it comes up out of the boot, then when they're cut, they'll turn yellow. They'll go to straw as opposed to keeping the green color. Cutting these oats for oat hay right now, there's a lot of water in the stalk. It takes quite a bit to dry them. Now this is the second day of September. We're not in the best of haying weather. If I was going to grow these solely as a hay crop, I would have planted them mid-May, so we'd be cutting them when you have the good haying weather in mid to late July. The reason for this crop right here, like I say, I've grown these to harvest for straw, for mulch for my vegetables. This crop is underseeded. Now you can't see it too well, but it's underseeded to a Timothy clover mix. We use here in Atlantic Canada, we use what's a triple mix. That's Timothy, red clover, and Alsite clover. Gives you a good stand of hay. Your first 2 or 3 years of hay crop off of this, it'll be predominantly clover. It's a better feed for cattle and sheep. But after the 3rd year or so, then the Timothy will be the predominant species, which makes a good horse hay. So this is an example of a cover crop, a green manure crop, that's grown for soil protection. I didn't want this ground washing when the floods comes up in the fall or spring, and producing a nutrient that isn't going to be used on this particular field, but it will be used at another place on the homestead. The mulch, of course, once it's applied to the vegetables or strawberries, then it's allowed to rot into the ground. And so in that way there, the mulch itself provides a weed suppression, and the rotting mulch, of course, provides nutrients going into the soil. Keeps the soil damp, prevents the soil from drying out in the heat of summertime. So there's a few benefits right there. So this is technically what they would call a nurse crop, because this field will be used for hay. So the oats provides a cover, and they get a root system in there to prevent the ground from eroding, wind erosion, water erosion, whatever. So this is an example of a green manure crop being used as a nurse crop. Okay, here's the second example of a green manure crop. This is all-site clover that has been interseeded or planted underneath a crop of sweet corn. I don't know how well we can see this down in here. There we are. This provides erosion control as well as providing nutrient to the corn as the clover grows. Clover, of course, being having the property of nitrogen fixation. The big thing with interseeding is finding the sweet spot when this stuff will seed in to the best advantage. Now this corn here, this is a dwarf sweet corn. It's an early version. This was planted in mid-May, and the clover I seeded in when the corn is about knee-high. So for us here planting the corn in mid-May, that means putting the clover in the middle of July. Now, one of the disadvantages to interseeding is you don't get weed suppression, as you can see with these lamb's quarters that's coming up in it here. We cultivate 3 or 4 times before interseeding, and once the clover is seeded in, of course, you can't do any cultivation. So even though we've got a green manure crop growing here, we have to come through and take the seed heads off the top of this lamb's quarter, because of course once the clover is grown, we can't come in here and do any mechanical cultivation. The one advantage to this is that once the corn is harvested and we cut the stalks for feeding our livestock, the clover is already established and it continues to grow through the fall, and it provides erosion protection through the fall and winter, early spring, until it's turned under for the next crop. Now here's a third example of a green manure cover crop. This is buckwheat, and it's in full flower here right now. I would have liked to have turned this under within the past week or two, but if you can see, I don't know if the camera will focus in here enough, this patch is absolutely swarming with pollinators. There's bees, hornets, every kind of insect that you can imagine that will do pollination all over these flowers. So I'm going to leave this standing for another week or two until the flower starts to drop off. Give the insects a chance to feed on this. Now this stuff, I'm going to back up here a little bit. As you can see, this is a pretty tall crop. There's some of these stalks here that they're over 5 feet high. If you were able to see down in the base of this, there is no weed cover at all on the ground. This stuff has just choked out every weed. I didn't plant this particularly thick, but buckwheat has such a tendency to grow thick and grow tall. It just suppresses everything that's underneath it. Now, another week or two, once the flowering is done here and the insects are off of this, I'll chop this and turn it under, and then this piece of ground will be planted to a fall rye for winter protection. Now here's an example of a crop itself providing weed suppression. These are pumpkins, field pumpkins. They're grown mostly for the use of our livestock. We'll store these in the barn, chop them up through the early part of the winter to feed the cattle and pigs. But these grow so thick and heavy. If you could see up across there, I see 3, maybe 4 stalks of crabgrass that's actually made it above the cover of these plants. And these have invaded right in through the sweet corn on the right side. There are 4 rows into the sweet corn right up in the top of the stalks. But in this instance here, The crop is growing so heavy, so thick, that if you were able to see down amongst the vines at ground level, there's no weeds underneath this crop. Now this crop was cultivated, I believe 4 times before the vines grew to the point that going in with a tiller or going in and hoeing around them, it wasn't possible any longer. But the crop cover itself helps to hold back the weeds, and of course once the vines die down, they'll be mulched, turned back into the soil. So in that way itself, the crop becomes a green manure as well as a weed suppression cover crop. This is another example of the crop cover providing weed suppression. This is a patch of potatoes, of course, and even though the stalks are starting to die back, it is, like I say, early September. As you can see from looking through these, there's no weeds in this patch. Now these were cultivated 5 times up to mid to late July, and as you can see, once the crop cover got big enough to take over, there just wasn't any room for weeds to come into this piece. It's important to keep the weeds down early on in the crop's development, and once your cover gets big enough, provided you've got the soil fertility to provide for a good top on your crops, weeds aren't going to be an issue. Okay, so there you have a glimpse at how we use green manure crops and cover crops for enriching the soil, weed suppression, and erosion control. Thanks for watching.